Mr. President, when is enough enough? With the start of 2024, we find ourselves in another presidential election cycle. And as we move closer to an election date in November, we can expect political tensions to rise. But as the new year begins, a rise in political violence threatens to overshadow the traditional presidential process. Across the country, at every level of government, we are experiencing a surge in violent threats against public officials and government workers. Some officials have been victims of swatting incidents in which false 9/11 calls lead to law enforcement swarming the homes of targeted individuals. In other cases, officials have received death threats or bomb threats where they live or work. And in some tragic instances, violent threats have escalated into violent acts. It should go without saying, but it is worth repeating. Political violence in furtherance of any cause, is unacceptable. But it's undeniable that the recent spike in violent threats and acts has one major source: the grievances of former President Trump. Just over 3 years after President Trump called his supporters to Washington, D.C., and directed them to this Senate chamber and Capitol building, where they staged a violent insurrection, his calls for retribution against his perceived enemies continue on an almost daily basis. Recent victims have included the Secretary of State in the state of Maine, the former Speaker of the Arizona House of Representatives, the employees of the Georgia Secretary of State's office, all of whom were targets of swatting and violent threats. These individuals were targeted for their roles in upholding the lawful result of the 2020 presidential election, or for their involvement in the upcoming election. Many election workers at lower levels have also been threatened, especially women and people of color. Just this morning, Politico published an article about the fears and concerns of local election workers and the conspiracy theories and threats that they face. These threats deter Americans from engaging in civic life or even seeking public office. The recent rise in political violence has not just affected those who run for office or help to run our elections. Judges, jurors, and officers of the court have also faced threats. Just last week, Justice Arthur Engoron, the New York State judge presiding over the former president's civil fraud trial, had his home swarmed by police after someone called in a fake bomb threat. This occurred hours after Trump took to his now favorite social media platform, Truth Social, and called Judge Engoron a, quote, Trump-hating judge. This came on the heels of similar swatting targeting of the homes of Jack Smith and Judge Tanya Chutkan, the special prosecutor pursuing criminal charges against the former president for election interference and the judge overseeing the case. The former president has repeatedly attacked both of these public servants by name. Last August, Judge Chutkan received a voicemail saying, and I quote, "If Trump doesn't get elected in 2024, we're coming to kill you, so tread lightly." On Christmas Eve, Trump called Special Counsel Smith, and I quote, deranged, and claimed he was one of President Biden's, quote, misfits and thugs. The very next day, the special counsel's home was targeted with a swatting call. The justices of the state Supreme Courts of Colorado and Wisconsin, along with staff, jurors, and prosecutors, have also faced threats due to their involvement in the former president's legal cases. All of these individuals have been targeted simply because they continue to fulfill their duties to uphold the law. All the while, former President Trump has refused to condemn the actions of his supporters, and at times he clearly encourages them. And yet we rarely hear any of our Republican colleagues criticize their de facto leader for his public threats of violence or his encouragement of his most extreme supporters. Threats of violence and violence are antithetical to our democracy, whatever their political source. In a free country, there are countless ways for people to legitimately and peacefully react and respond to political events and outcomes with which they disagree. People can vote as they choose. They can encourage their fellow citizens to do likewise. They can organize and advocate, whether by knocking on doors, speaking at rallies, or posting on social media. They can peaceably assemble and protest public officials and the policies they pursue. In the United States, these kinds of political activities are not merely tolerated, they are encouraged, and they are protected by the Constitution and the force of law. But we cannot, as a nation, tolerate, let alone encourage, threats of political violence by anyone, including the former President of the United States. The recent rise in political violence marks a renewed attempt to use violence and the threat of violence to intimidate public officials, election workers, and our fellow American voters. Sadly, the specter of political violence is not new. In 1968, another presidential election year, one marred by heinous acts of violence, Robert Kennedy gave remarks the day after Martin Luther King was assassinated. He spoke about the mindless menace of violence in America, and he quoted Abraham Lincoln, who more than a century before wrote, "Among free men there can be no successful appeal from the ballot to the bullet, and those who take such an appeal are sure to lose their case and pay the cost." Today I'm calling on my colleagues in both political parties to publicly condemn the state of violence which is dominating in this country. We have come to accept it as commonplace. Shame on us in that regard. If this true democracy is to succeed, we all have to speak out against violence on both sides of the equation. We must stand together in opposing violence and threats of violence. Our democracy is strong, but it is only as strong as the people who participate in it, protect it, and who serve it. I yield the floor.